Hello everyone, I am Iman Gudarzi. As we have learned so far, we have some problems with reproducibility of our research and papers. So there are different ways to cover and resolve this issue. And one of the trending one is pre-registration. So in this section, I want to talk about pre-registration. And as there is controversy on this solution, we want to cover two different papers from two different points of view. So let's look at the articles that we want to talk about today. The first article is Pre-Registration, Why and How, written by Simmons and Nelson in 2021. And the second article is Pre-Registration is Neither Sufficient nor Necessary for Good Science, written by Pham and All in 2021. Just before to go through the articles, let's see the outlines of the articles and what topics that they want to cover. The first article is about why and how pre-registration is good. So they provide why pre-registration is a good idea, and they respond to some arguments against pre-registration. Then they talk about how we can write a good pre-registration and even review a pre-registration. And they provide some comments about the rapid popularity of pre-registration. On the other hand, the second article is more challenging, and they don't believe in pre-registration, so they come up with some implementation challenges. Then they go through the whether or not pre-registration is sufficient for good science or necessary for good science. And finally, they provide some risks of adverse effects of pre-registration. So let's start with the first article, then go through the second. Before we start, we need to know what is the definition of pre-registration. Pre-registration is the practice of documenting your research plan at the beginning of your study and storing that plan in a read-only public repository, such as OSF registries or other websites or platforms. So what is important in pre-registration is planning and providing some information about your research before you start your paper or research. That's the point of the pre-registration. So why pre-registration is important? The authors believe that scientists' jobs include finding true facts about the world, as well as interpreting those facts by building theories to predict the future. But they think that probably you cannot competently do the second part without doing the first part. So you cannot generate correct theories on a foundation of incorrect facts. And they believe that unfortunately in the social sciences, a lot of facts are wrong. So many published findings do not replicate under specificable conditions, and so they are untrue. What do you think about the number of false findings that the authors mention? Is that true? Or you think probably most of the articles and findings are right and true? As you probably said, there are different arguments against that claim, but the authors try to answer only one of them about the immorality and incompetence of researchers. So they think that the bulk of the problem is not caused by the immorality or incompetence. It is caused by the selective reporting of analysis that generate desirable results. They provide an example to communicate the meaning of this phenomenon. I don't want to spend time on this, but you can pause the video and read these 2 pages. That example that you have seen is about p-hacking, a phenomenon that authors try to resolve with pre-registration. So what is p-hacking? P-hacking, based on Simonson and his colleagues, is the misuse of data analysis to find patterns in data that can be presented as statistically significant, so dramatically increasing and understating the risk of the false positives. So that's the point this article wants to mention, that the pre-registration can decrease the p-hacking phenomenon and false positive. So as there are a lot of concerns and ambiguities about pre-registration, the authors try to write about pre-registration process. So they state that pre-registration involves specifying the research question or hypothesis under study, the relevant independent and dependent variables, any relevant control variables, and more importantly, how sample size will be determined,
and the rules for deciding which observations will be excluded from the analysis, and the precise specification of the key analysis. So that's important to know. In pre-registration, you don't need to provide any details or a lot of different titles and details. The only thing that you need to communicate is about some parts of the process that you want to conduct your research. For example, what is the main question, and what are the variables that you want to measure, and what do you think about the key analysis that you want to use. So these are the main things that you need to provide in your pre-registration. So the authors believe that there are some advantages in pre-registration for both researchers and the field. They think that it would be beneficial for researchers to get more credits because they can defend their research against p-hacking and false positives. On the other hand, for the field, it's important and advantageous because it can decrease the p-hacking and increase the transparency.
Now, authors try to say how to write a pre-registration or how to pre-register our research. They provide some should and shouldn't tips, as you can see here, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on them, but you can pause the video and read. And moreover, they provide some tips for the reviewer to know how to review a pre-registration. And the main thing that they mention is pre-registration is for decreasing p-hacking and increasing transparency. So we cannot expect pre-registration to solve all the problems, all the issues of the articles. So they state that pre-registration cannot solve unreported studies, hidden confounds, invalid tests, and a lot of other things. So for the comments, I think this article has two faces, one positive and its strength, and some negative or limitations. So for their strength, I think the notion of pre-registration is almost new. So and as we could see in the article, there are a lot of ambiguities about the process of pre-registration, the definition, the should and shouldn't. So it's really beneficial and advantageous to do more research, to provide more concrete definitions and reliable processes of pre-registration. On the other hand, most of the arguments that this article provide and try to resolve were based on the author's experiences, not a meta-analysis or any new papers or any exploration actually. So they just provide a discussion based on their beliefs and or based on their anecdotes. So it would be beneficial to do more research in this topic and compare different articles with or without pre-registration. So I think these are the main issues of or limitations and positive things about this article. So for the key takeaways, I should mention that two of the important things from this article are that pre-registration is good for transparency and reducing p-hacking. These are the main points of this article, as well as how to write a good pre-registration. These are the points in this article. Now let's go to the next article. Pre-registration is neither sufficient nor necessary for good science, written by Pham and Oh in 2021. In this article, authors believe that some researchers and some studies put much value on pre-registration, and they believe that there are some issues with p-hacking or questionable research practices or reproducibility actually crisis, but they think that pre-registration is not sufficient or good for the science. So first of all, they start with how pre-registration should help. They state that in theory it should discourage the selective reporting of results,
forestall the non-transparent use of questionable research practices or QRPs, and prevent the presentation of post hoc hypotheses informed by the results as though they were a priori hypothesis, a practice that is known as harking, hypothesizing after the results are known. But the main question is, to what extent pre-registration should be embraced as a standard scientific practice for consumer research? So the authors start with some implementation challenges, then go deeper to the fundamental issues with pre-registration. They state that the pre-registration's overall administrative costs would be high in terms of researchers' time to prepare and submit the pre-registration documents, gatekeepers' time for evaluating the alignment between submitted manuscript and corresponding pre-registrations, and the substantial financial cost of building and maintaining an infrastructure such as OSF that is capable of supporting pre-registration on a large scale. Moreover, they think that it is challenging to interpret pre-registration records with the current registration infrastructure. For example, published study numbers do not necessarily correspond to their numbering on the pre-registration site, or search of a particular study protocol often retrieves multiple versions of similar protocols, or pre-registration records may lack sufficient details. Moreover, they state that given the important role of customer culture theory research or CCT research plays in the generation of knowledge and identity of our field, it is problematic to envision pre-registration as a scientific norm if it would exclude such a substantial portion of the field. So, as you can see, most of these first challenges, the previous study answered these challenges in some way. It's really interesting that both of the articles are published in 2021, but they have some arguments related to each other. So the first article answers some of the questions about and critiques about the cost and time of pre-registration. They said that it would be short and efficient, and it decreased the steps of the research. So in somehow it decreased the cost of the the pre-registration process, and it doesn't prevent exploratory research or some fundamental research like what we do in CCT research. But moreover, the authors think that even if a legitimate analysis plan was previously registered, during the review process, editors and reviewers may still request that authors perform additional analysis of the data, which can result in defeating pre-commitment to a particular analytical plan. As you can see, the first study actually answered these type of issues, and at the section that they provide some tips for reviewers, they state that pre-registration is just for increasing the transparency, so they can provide and separate the results and analyses that are not pre-registered. On the other hand, they can state that these results are confirmatory or pre-registered. Finally, the authors here think that a related issue arises when the study rests on analysis of pre-existing data, like secondary data or analyzing data from Amazon website. So I think that it would be an issue, because no one can believe that you didn't do any analysis on pre-existing data to provide your hypothesis. So I think that's the only issue here the author can raise. So for the fundamental issues, the authors provide three main concerns and questions about the pre-registration. They state that is it sufficient or necessary for good science? And moreover, they provide some risk of adverse effects of pre-registration. Before we start talking about these questions, I want to say that as we have already know from the previous study, pre-registration has nothing to do with being sufficient for good science or being even necessary for this good science, but it is the start point for increasing the transparency and give the audience and readers the ability to decide what types of analyses and results that we have done are exploratory or one of them are confirmatory. So it can increase the transparency and decrease p-hacking. So these are the main goals of the pre-registration. So this argument is not necessarily valid because pre-registration, the goal of the pre-registration is not being sufficient for good science or being even necessary for good science. So it has some problems. It cannot answer some issues. It is not suitable for all kinds of research. So I think this argument is not necessarily valid. But let's start with the first question of the authors. They state that pre-registration is probably not sufficient for good science, and they provide different things like the illusion of they believe that pre-registration is an illusion of transparency as well as an illusion of robustness. They provide some inference fallacies, as well as they believe that some pre-registration research can be reproducible, but they are pointless sciences. For the transparency, they provide some good issues. Actually, they state that researchers may select which particular study or hypothesis to pre-register. They may pre-register a study only after running a long series of calibration tests, or they can, pre-register multiple studies, but only report a selection. And more worse, a form of fraud can be occurred as known as parking, pre-registering after results are known. So these are the issues of transparency. On the other hand, for the robustness, they believe that robust means capable of performing without failure under a wide range of conditions. So they believe that a particular finding was anticipated under a pre-registered protocol doesn't mean that one can reasonably expect to observe it again and again. It only means that one is likely to observe it under the specific conditions of the pre-registered protocol. So pre-registration doesn't guarantee robustness. For the fallacy, they talk about the time of the collecting data. So for example, they said that in a pre-registration system, more credence is typically given to a statistical analysis if it was pre-specified before data collection than if it was adopted after the data have been collected, considering that post-data collection analyses are open to researcher degrees of freedom. And they think this would be misleading because from a science standpoint, what should logically matter is not the point in time at which a particular analysis is selected, but whether the analysis is appropriate given the nature of the data and nature of the prediction being tested. I think it's not the time, the point is not the time, and so the credence is not given to the time, is given to the transparency. So that's the point of the pre-registration. So for the next question, the authors ask that is pre-registration necessary for good science? They state that probably it's not because of a couple of reasons. They mention that the reproducibility crisis is not as much severe as some articles and authors state. Moreover, they think most of the articles in consumer research are exploratory rather than confirmatory. Although I don't agree with this statement, and I think most of the articles are confirmatory because they have a lot of concrete hypotheses. They know what they want to measure, what would be the analysis. So they
they provide some hypotheses based on theories. So these kinds of research can be confirmatory, although there are some exploratory results from the articles or analysis. The next statement is that the authors believe that exploration and serendipity happens in scientific progress. And they think that they state that exploratory research is good for science, and they think it has some advantages. And most of the interesting things and findings come out from exploratory research. And pre-registration would decrease the exploratory research and prevent authors and researchers to do exploratory analysis and research. Moreover, they think there are other paths for reproducibility. And they state that a variety of methods can improve the transparency and reproducibility of research, including better research training, incentives for replications, sharing of detailed study protocols, and so on. I think all of these mechanisms have their own pros and cons. So as we say that there are different ways to increase the reproducibility, it doesn't mean that they are good or they can be used instead of pre-registration. So we need to consider all of them. So we need to compare the advantages and disadvantages of all those methods and mechanisms. So finally, the authors provide some risks of adverse effects of pre-registration. But as I think, all these risks are based on some assumptions related to that statement that suggests pre-registration would decrease the decrease the flexibility of methodology, or it can cause costs and higher costs. So I think all of these risks are based on these assumptions that the authors wanted to promote in their previous concerns, issues, and questions. But as probably they were solved, as we discussed, they are not valid more. So the authors provide some suggestions to how to use pre-registration and when it would be more beneficial, and some general suggestions to how we can improve our field of study and field of science. But none of the suggestions. Just like the first article, I think there are some advantages and limitations in this article. For the strength, I should mention that it was really useful that they provide a range of issues and concerns about the pre-registration, because as we said earlier, this notion is really new. So there are a lot of ambiguities about the process and consequences of the pre-registration. So we need more research like this to argue that the benefits and disadvantages of pre-registration to increase the transparency, actually. On the other hand, I think most of the arguments that they provide are based on some assumptions that are not valid anymore, because most of them, we answered actually most of them in the first article, and they didn't provide any new assumptions or premises to provide their arguments. So they start with implication critiques and then go to fundamental questions and issues. But as you could see, most of the arguments were based on the same assumptions. So they just changed the questions, changed the face of the argument, but the foundation of the argument was the same for most of their arguments. So I think as we resolve them, probably in the first article, most of the arguments are not valid anymore. So for the key takeaways, I think the most important thing in this article is that pre-registration is not the only way of increasing transparency or reducing p-hacking. So that's the important thing
that we need to know pre-registration is not the only tool that we have to provide a good science and good study and good research actually. So thank you very much and have a great day.